in your opinion, who wrote Hebrews?
Ah, see, you're giving me a free advertisement for another book then,
Oh,
is
all right.
what you're doing.
Okay.
So, yeah, last year I published a larger volume, and this is on the Pauline letters. So the book is called The Pauline Corpus in Early Christianity, published by Hendrickson, and it's much larger than Creating the Canon. If you want a good introduction on canon, I would start with Creating the Canon.
Hmm.
But if you want to get really deep into all these issues that surround Paul, I would go to the Pauline Corpus in Early Christianity. And I have a chapter where I explore what's going on with Hebrews, and because it's very fascinating. It's anonymous, but there's a few things to note here. It's anonymous, but the readers knew who the author was. So
Hmm.
the readers are not accepting this work and saying, well, we don't know who wrote it, but it's really good.
Yeah.
And, maybe
Yeah.
the Lord is leading us to accept this writing, even though we don't have a clue who wrote it. That's not what happened. Clearly, the reader and the author knew each other very well. We know that from the very end of chapter 13.
Hmm.
But it's a very unique writing because it doesn't have the greeting like you would expect in the beginning of Paul's writings. But then another interesting component of this is that when we look at the textual history, we look at all of the early Greek manuscripts and even the versions, Latin, Coptic, and all these different texts. Every manuscript, biblical manuscript that has Hebrews is always placed as a Pauline epistle. It's always grouped with Paul's. It never appears anywhere else. And a lot of times people think of it as a Catholic epistle or a general epistle, but you actually don't have any manuscripts where Hebrews is placed in the middle of the Catholic epistles or circulate along with that
Can
particular
you
corpus of
can you
writings.
explain Catholic epistles real quickly, just for people to understand what you mean by that term?
Yeah, that's probably a good question there for clarification, but I'm using it in the same sense that Eusebius used it. So the term Catholic epistles, it goes way back 1600 years at least. And they actually use this term to describe something that's universal in nature. So when I say Catholic epistles, I don't mean they came out of the Vatican or they
Yeah.
were written by the Pope or endorsed by the. That's not the point. It's used in the original sense of universal,
Yeah.
and you just have that word kata, according to, and then halos in Greek would be the entirety or the whole of something. So
Hmm.
it's something that relates to the whole is the idea. But
Yeah.
the Catholic epistles, the terminology denotes that they're different than Paul's letters because Paul is writing to specific communities. You have letters to Thessalonica and Colossae and Ephesus, right? So they're very particular in who they're written to. But the Catholic epistles, or as we often describe them, the general epistles, are written to a larger community originally, right? So there are individuals that are mentioned in the greetings, but it's very broad. It's not just those in one city.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what we mean by Catholic. It's in a universal sense. So it emphasizes that these writings are more for a general audience.
Yeah. I just wanted to touch on that since you used that term a few times. So
Yeah,
so
yeah.
back, if you want, you can finish your thoughts
Yeah,
on
so I
Hebrews.
was talking about Hebrews and how it
Yeah.
never circulated as part of the general epistles, or as I said, Catholic epistles.
Hmm.
Always circulates as a Pauline letter. But that creates a lot of problems in the minds of a lot of readers today because they look at Hebrews and they say, well, clearly Paul did not write it, but it always circulates as a Pauline letter. So how do we get around that? Well, when we go back to the early church, we find that the vast majority of church fathers believed that Paul was in fact the author. So it wasn't as though the church just thought of this as anonymous. The majority of them believed it was Paul. And so I can say this categorically. We may not like this, but it's just historical. It's just historical truth. Hebrews would have never made it into the New Testament canon, been recognized as scripture, had it not been for its association with Paul.
Hmm.
Its close association with Paul is the reason why it was part of the Pauline letter corpus. And as I said, the New Testament, as we think about it, is a collection of collections. So we don't have Hebrews kind of entering into the New Testament canon on its own. It comes in as part of the Pauline letter corpus. And so to get into the New Testament canon, you first have to be part of a subcorpora. You have to be part of a subcollection. And that would be either the fourfold gospel, Pauline epistles, Catholic epistles, Revelation, or Acts. So it always circulated as a Pauline letter, not as this independent work that was just somehow accepted later. It was always considered Pauline
Yeah.
in the early church. It always circulated as a Pauline letter. Now that
Yeah.
wasn't 100%. There wasn't. It wasn't as though no one in the early church dissented or cast. Had questions about this. Tertullian, for example, in one place he argues that Barnabas was the author.
Yeah.
But for him, that's not a big problem because Barnabas is a close associate with Paul. So it's indirectly related to Paul, even if you accept that view for Tertullian. There was another who thought that maybe it was written by someone else. Gaius of Rome was his name, and he denied Pauline authorship, and a few others. But the vast majority of the church was convinced Paul wrote it, and that's why it circulated as a Pauline letter. So that's how it makes its way into the New Testament.
Yeah.
Now to go back to your original question then, who do I think wrote it? Do I think Paul wrote Hebrews? Well, for me to answer that, I have to kind of return to a subject we talked about near the beginning of this conversation, and that had to do with Paul's method of writing. And we said it's a collaborative effort, and he's actually going to use a secretary to compose these works. So technically, I would say Paul did not write Hebrews. He was not the penman. But what do I think happened? Well, I actually defer to Origen here. Origen said something that I think is very profound, and we have the record of this in Eusebius. But Origen said, and he's often misquoted, poor Origen, I think he's misquoted here, but Origen said, "Who wrote this? Only God knows." Well, he actually stated that right after he describes the process that he believed happens. And I actually follow right along with Origen here. I think he was correct. The more I look at this, the more correct I think he was. But Origen believed that the text of Hebrews originated as an oral address. We might call it a sermon or a homily, something like that. But it starts off as a single, not a series, but a single oral address. So think of it like a sermon that might have been delivered, or address that might have been delivered, maybe in a Jewish context, maybe in a synagogue gathering or something. And in fact, he refers to it as a word of exhortation at the end of it. A paraklesios, I believe, is the technical term for that. Just like we find that language in Acts, when Paul goes to the synagogue in Antioch of Syria. No, Antioch of Pisidia. He goes into the synagogue, and the individual refers to Paul, and he says, "Hey, if any of you have a word of exhortation, go ahead." And Paul stands up and, of course, addresses them. So that's the term that's used. It's a word of exhortation, which was often a oral address and oral delivery. So Origen says we start with that, an oral address, and then he says someone who is a disciple of Paul or an associate of Paul, in his leisure went and wrote down what Paul had said. So I actually see a correlation between Hebrews and Mark's gospel. I think a similar process happened here. So do I think that Peter wrote Mark's gospel? Well, no. But I do think that the source of Mark's gospel was Peter. Yep. So we start with addresses of, actually probably more than one in the case of Mark's gospel, a series of oral addresses that Mark is the hermeneutes. He's the interpreter. He's writing down these things and then composing the text. And I think we actually have something similar with Hebrews. I think we start off with a Pauline sermon, and then we have a companion of Paul. If I had to bet, I would say maybe someone like Luke, and he's actually going to write down this sermon. He's going to be responsible for the composition. So Luke is actually the author in the sense that he's writing down the words and composing it. The words are actually someone like Luke, but the sermon, the content would go to Paul, is my understanding. Yeah. So it's very different. It's not Paul dictating a text to a scribe. It's Paul delivering a sermon for a live audience, and then the composition would have actually come from someone like Luke. And so that answers a lot of questions. Historically, it explains why we have this writing associated with Paul in the first place. But then we also have the thorny issue of all the unique vocabulary and stylistic features of Hebrews. It seems very different than the other Pauline writings. And I would say that's because of the role of someone like Luke, who's writing down things. So no different than Mark's gospel. Mark has a role in the composition. So he's going to be responsible for the exact wording and the style. And Paul's associate, whether it be Luke or Timothy or someone else, they would have actually been responsible for the composition that is known as Hebrews today. So that's kind of my understanding of Hebrews, very similar to Origen. And I said that Origen is misquoted. The reason why is because when Origen said, "Who wrote this? Only God knows," he wasn't actually referring to the content. He was referring to the individual who served than as the secretary. So we
Yeah.
confuse secretary with author there. And what he
Yeah.
was saying is, I don't know who the secretary was. I theorized it was Luke,
Hmm.
but Origen said who it was, God only knows. But he pointed back to Paul as
Hmm.
the source of the material. And I think that's a wise way for us to look at it as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've never heard that explanation before, and it makes a lot of sense. Because one of the big issues is, if it was Paul, why didn't it include his normal greeting? Well,
Yeah,
what if it wasn't a letter?
exactly.
There
Yep.
you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Wow. And then, yeah, and it would make sense, too, if we theorized that it was Luke who actually wrote it down, because stylistically it reads in some ways like Luke, especially whenever you read the sermons that Luke wrote in Acts. And if this was a sermon that he delivered in one of his missionary journeys, well, we know from Acts that Luke was with him on a good number of those. So, wow, that is excellent.
Yeah,
Man,
there's a
what?
couple reasons, not to belabor the point, but there's a couple reasons I kind of point to Luke. One is there's a lot of terms and expressions that are very similar to Luke and Acts that are in Hebrew. So we actually can draw some parallels there.
Hmm.
We see some similar wording and vocabulary and structure and that type of thing. But also, we know that Luke, he was very accomplished in writing down speeches. I mean, you just look at Luke and Acts. We find many parables and teachings of Jesus, and then we go to Acts and we find several speeches that are recorded in Acts.
Yeah.
So what I think Hebrews is, I think it's very similar to the speeches that are recorded in Acts. Only this one is a lot longer. So it made for a book on its own, right? It'd be like if he decided to, instead of giving us a summary of Peter's address at Pentecost, he may have decided to make it an entire work on its own. And instead of kind of truncating it or abridging it for what he included in Acts, he's going to just give us a lengthy word for word kind of writing that actually has the entire text of that sermon. And so I think that's what Hebrews is. It's not a summary. It's a longer sermon that made for its own writing. It's so lengthy you can't really fit in anything else. It's a standalone sermon.
Yeah.
And so I think Luke, he had a habit of doing this, and so I think he did the same with Hebrews. That's my theory, but Origen is right. You know, we have to have some humility. We can't know for sure who the penman was. I just have a suspicion that Luke could have been involved.